Well, first, thanks to George for a lot of remarkable thoughts, drawing on an exemplary career, but I feel a bit challenged. I did not realize I would have to make recourse to musical theater in order to follow appropriately. This is not one of my stronger Jeopardy categories. I'm thinking Oklahoma. The farmer and the rancher can be friends. I don't know. I'm a little stumped. So we need to look backwards, and I'm going to look backwards very quickly in one thing personally, and then with respect to the topic of this forum. I believe it's the case that the first interactions that I had with George were at the first EERS that I attended, and that actually led to some sequence whereby we've had the pleasure of working together on some things, especially the AEA Evaluation Policy Task Force, along with Eleanor. With respect to Eleanor, I want to look backwards just a little bit. Do you have the, oh, it's here, sorry. In terms of the paper that she gave here, subsequently published in AJE, where she made the remarks that led to the forum. And in essence, at least as I understand it, part of what she wanted to do was to lead to more productive conversations, interactions, sort of conceptual and practical developments between individuals who spend the larger portion of their time practicing evaluation and individuals who spend a relatively larger proportion of their time writing about evaluation, thinking, the kinds of people that get this kind of funny label of evaluation theorist. And as the hand-raising exercise showed, that distinction is artificial. Every practicing evaluator has at least implicitly a kind of evaluation theory, a mental model of this. Almost all people who get called evaluation theorists engage in evaluation practice, but there's probably some distinction that's worth attending to. And although I don't think Eleanor emphasized this, one of the reasons for trying to create this kind of interaction is to try to avoid what Ernie House years ago, in the midst of the so-called paradigm wars, evaluation in sort of engulfed in debate between qualitative and quantitative, Ernie pointed out that there was an awful lot of human capital being wasted. You had people who were sitting in this kind of fight about philosophical paradigms and methods that could be better put to use doing evaluations that might have a chance to make a difference. It could be better put to use trying to solve common practice problems that evaluators encountered. And I think Eleanor, while it wasn't something that she highlighted, one of the benefits of the kind of suggestion that she had is to reduce the extent to which you have those. And we've certainly seen it again and again, the RCT debate that George alluded to and so on. Eleanor made 4 suggestions. One of them, she referred to an ongoing forum. And the second was the last one was an annual debate on a specific balance issue. I think this forum over the years has been to some extent a blend of those, sometimes more towards point D. With respect to the forum, she wanted to have conversations. I remember she was working on this paper. She was talking about, is there some online way that you can get people to report what their common problems are, the things they encounter in practice, and then you engage some of the kinds of people who do more writing about evaluation, who think about evaluation methods, and so on, who perhaps because they're paid by a university have more flexibility around the kinds of things that they address. Can we get back and forth between those? Here somebody makes a proposal, it goes back. I think it's a great idea, and one of the things that I'm mentioning this look backwards is that I think it's worth us collectively, as we look forward thinking about additional ways after the support for this forum is over, to think about how to continue that kind of exchange, that kind of what are the common practice problems of the day? Those may vary different areas of evaluation practice. But what are those things, and how do we then get very productive kinds of discussion, interactions between those who are in a different kind of production, not necessarily evaluation findings, but thoughts, ideas about evaluation. So I've tried, based on George's PowerPoints, to have some potential comments, and we're going to just wave at some of these PowerPoints as they go by. You're going to have to selectively focus or speed read, but so it goes. So he has these 5 bullets. The first one was the adequacy of proof. One of the things I want to do is just a sort of an advertisement for evaluation theory. I'm the Sean Spicer. I'm going to come out and... sorry. Now we're all distracted in bad ways. I'm very sorry. Anyway, Will Shadish, when he was, the year he was president of AEA, made this comment about what we need is people, we learn methods. What we need is to figure out when to apply various methods and why. He says, evaluation theory tells us that. He also said, evaluation theory is who we are. How do you convince someone, what's the sort of coin of the realm that says I'm an evaluator, as opposed to I'm an applied social researcher with certain kinds of methodological skills? Presumably that also comes from the kind of knowledge that's encompassed in evaluation theory and the frames of mind that brings, the flexibility that brings. A phrase I love, I've tried to Google this and figure out, I think Campbell or Cronbach said something like this, but I haven't found it recently, about evaluation theory as a guide to judgment, not a dispensation from it. It should help you think better about the practice issues that you face, including what counts as credible evidence. It doesn't give you a paint by number. Benefit of being multilingual. I don't think there's a lot to be argued for being an advocate of a particular evaluation theory as opposed to being fluent in multiple evaluation theories that give you the kinds of frames that you can bring to the different situations that you are engaged in. Shadish, Cook, and Leviton. I wish Laura was here so I could give a bow to her on this respect. Talked about 5 different components that a good and comprehensive evaluation theory will have. If you don't know this framework, it's worth knowing this framework alone, in part because it helps us think about things that we may not think about. Knowing what you don't know. A lot of times if you talk to evaluators, what's your view of evaluation theory? What's your view of how evaluation gets done? They leave out some things like, what's this thing that's getting evaluated? How does it operate? Where is there leverage for making a difference? But in terms of knowledge construction, there's a wide variety of stances by different evaluation theorists. You go from Campbell, a kind of post-positivist who talks about validity threats, things that might alternatively explain a given finding. You go to Guba and Lincoln, who are more constructivist, who remind us things like, we're often making claims about people's experiences. Perhaps you should validate those by having those people say, yes, that makes sense. Again, values of being eclectic, values of recognizing multiple perspectives, knowledge construction. And here, I rarely find myself in anything that can seem as a disagreement with George, and I don't think this is a disagreement, but it may be a difference in emphasis. And I come to this point from some other experiences. Mixed methods, I think, often make sense, in part because evaluations typically rely on multiple questions. Even if one is predominant, you have to have other kinds of knowledge to support that and to ask related things. But sometimes I think, just as we got people that fetishize randomized trials, it's possible to fetishize multiple methods and to think having multiple methods, whether you've really carefully thought about why those methods, and I'll be willing to say, I think sometimes mixing methods, I think sometimes multiple methods, it may make more sense to have two quantitative than a qualitative and a quantitative. It may make more sense to have two qualitative rather than a quantitative and a qualitative. I encourage us not to be reflexive about method choices. Some thoughts about persuading, convincing or persuading. I love that George put that up. A couple of quick thoughts. One is that when we talk about evaluation theory, we shouldn't forget that there are theories from other bodies of scholarship, from other areas of investigation. And when we think about things like persuading, there is research and theory from outside of evaluation that's highly relevant to that. In terms of people within evaluation, you've got some pretty disparate poles beyond the question of convincing or persuading, where Campbell essentially talking about evaluation as evaluators as servants to the experimenting society, kind of had this argument, you get the best available evidence, you present that to people, there's other processes that are involved in terms of whether it gets used or not. But you've done a good by injecting information into the possible discussion. Michael Patton takes a very different view, right? It's intended use by intended users, and your job as an evaluator from beginning to end is to try to make sure that that happens. Very different. I think there's a lot of intermediate roles, and that's where the persuasion versus convincing comes in. And I think part of the problem is that we don't, as often as we should, think about evaluation itself as an intervention in the world that has the analog of a logic model, a program theory, a set of steps, including the possibility of emergent things that happen, the policy topics can change and so on. And if we thought about those dominoes, we would probably be better able to say things like, well, I, as someone in the Inspector General's office, can only deal with domino number one, and then it goes to the policy setting community. Then it goes to the people out there who are engaged in this particular arena, whereas there may be somebody at a foundation that has a particular set of values, that has a particular kind of mission, that can go much further down those sets of dominoes in terms of their engagement with various policy actors. And I think, again, if we think about evaluation a bit more as an intervention in the world with things like program theories, it enables us to talk about those alternatives a little bit better. He mentioned evaluator independence. As I was looking at his PowerPoint, and it struck me even more as I was listening to George, it occurs that very often when people talk about independence of evaluators, they talk about it in terms of some kind of structural arrangement. Who does the evaluator report to? Do they report somebody high enough in the food chain? Or do they report to somebody who has operational command of the particular program? Are they an internal evaluator or are they an external evaluator? George referred and said to aspects of the evaluator, their behavior, their attitude, their stance. I think that's a valuable addition to the way that we think about evaluator independence. I'll also mention, if you read Michael Scriven, at various points, he and others argue strongly for meta-evaluation in real time, and part of that is a kind of an attempt to get rid of what you might call perspectival bias, where you want to be friends with this person. Well, are you making judgments along the line that are defensible? As you'll notice, I'm trying to go quickly through these. Partly there's a very rich set of things. George mentioned the evaluator as coach. We see that a lot in some areas, various kinds of programs where projects are funded, evaluation is mandated, you don't have the budget to do some comprehensive kind of evaluation as you might. And I would say in this, as in most things, it's good to have multiple arrows in the quiver. Coaching would be one option. Another option is to be formative to the extent the budget allows. Another option, Holy and others years ago talked about rapid feedback evaluation kind of thing where you come in and you visit. Very often you go to an organization, they've already got a lot of data. They have a lot of information, it's just that nobody has had the charge or the time to review it and try to make sense of it. Sometimes you can do a kind of review of existing information and be in good shape. So just there are these thoughts. By the way, very often the problem probably lies in the funder and the way they mandate evaluation, sort of an equal percentage to every project regardless of the size of that, regardless of the extent to which there's a learning opportunity. And if they're doing this for management purposes, that's one thing. But if they're doing this for evaluation purposes, years ago, Cronbach talked about an illuminative function that evaluators are supposed to perform. We can be illuminative about evaluation and talk to those funders about how to fund the next time. It probably doesn't make sense to give the same percentage to every project for evaluation. Some of them probably have far better opportunities for learning. Some of them are more mission central, et cetera. You know, how about a better process for doing that? Meaning of report, couple of things quickly. One is that in some instances that report might be better if it's not a set of findings, but if there's a conceptual framework. A second is that we should remember that the findings that make a difference aren't always the ones that were the focal questions as the evaluation started. I see Deb Rogg in the front row. It always reminds me of early evaluations of homelessness, where information about the characteristics of the homeless population were probably more important than the focal evaluation questions. Findings, early welfare reform. The fact that, oh my gosh, you can implement a different system for welfare than the old standards, that was probably more important than the specific findings. We should be aware of that. Related to that is something we might call procedural influence, which is to say, you know, process evaluation or process use, something Michael Patton has emphasized, and many other people have written about, the idea that being involved in an evaluation itself can have consequences of import, not just the findings. Well, I think we can broaden that to perhaps procedural influence. The characteristics of an evaluation may be important in terms of how they change the way people think. One telling of a story about the run-up to welfare reform a couple of administrations ago was that there were funders, including foundations, that helped to make sure that children's well-being was measured in multiple ways in many of the state-level evaluations. Why? Because the fact that those measures were there, it was thought, would increase the extent to which policymakers, as they did their work, considered children's well-being as an important component of the debate. So it's kind of a salience effect. Professional development, just years ago, Cronbach and Associates, I think it's a 1980 book. The last chapter was largely about that. Has gotten less attention by most evaluation theorists. When we have that conversation, we probably need to remember that there are multiple groups that we need to worry about their training and professional development with respect to evaluation. A lot of people you find doing evaluation are accidental evaluators. They're occasional evaluators. They come up through the service ranks, for example. They have a methods course in their master's degree program, so they become the evaluator in the organization. We need to be concerned about those people, some of whom are going to be doing evaluation for 3 years before they move on to some other administrative position. So just to say, it's a really important topic. It's a little bit more variegated than for people like probably most of you in this room who are long-term evaluators. George had a great ending. I'm going to try to match it, which is simply to say, this stuff is important. You know, evaluators don't get called to do their work on stuff that's easy. They don't get called, for the most part, to do their work on stuff that's trivial. The potential consequences of the kinds of things that we evaluate make a difference. So it's noble, and thank you, and I'll leave before I choke.